we've completed putting on all the wires. So now we're going to bend it the way that it's actually going to be going um, onto the wristband or the sensor module. Basically, it's going to look like that. Um, Feel free to squish the wires whichever way is most comfortable. But you can see that the two boards are now able to be very flat against each other, and that's what we want because we want the whole module to be as thin as possible. Okay, next we're going to put on the power connector that goes to the battery. Normally you would want to use something that locks, so like a lockable connector, kind of like this one that has this little latch that you push on and then it releases. Unfortunately, we don't have that one in stock at the moment, so we're just going to use the standard header pins. These obviously don't lock, but we could replace it with the lockable kind later when we have them. Okay, I've cut off 2 pins of the male header, and we're now going to solder them to the correct pins on the sensor board. Now notice I'm holding it with my finger, which means you have to work really fast, otherwise you burn your finger. But this allows me to hold the solder with these 2 hands, you know, kind of like using chopsticks, and with the other finger I can hold the connector. But yeah, just like that. And yeah. I touch it up again. Yeah, that's it. Okay, next we want to add a power switch. However, we don't have any power switches at the moment. So we're just going to put a little jumper across 2 of these vias. And for a jumper, you can use any wire, but something that works pretty well is just you take an old resistor and just snip off a little piece that's about the right length. And then we'll use that little piece as the jumper. Okay, to put the jumper on, we're going to use the trick again of putting solder on the via first before we bring in the jumper. So you heat it up and you feed in the solder. Make sure it goes all the way in, gets sucked up in the hole so that there's a bulge of solder sticking up above it. Okay, now using your tweezers, you pick up the little jumper, and all you have to do is touch the ends of the jumper with a soldering iron. And here you see the advantage of using a long soldering iron tip, because it allows you to touch multiple leads at the same time. Okay, the next step is we want to pre-fill these connections for the EDA electrodes. We're going to pre-fill them with solder so that it'll be easier to put the electrodes on later. So these vias are pretty big, so they take a lot of solder to fill up. So you just have to feed in enough solder so that they're nice and full. We want to add some epoxy so that we have a strain relief for the wires. So here we have some fast setting epoxy and the popsicle stick. So I'm going to squirt that in. Now one trick here is that if you twist the popsicle stick, you'll get a frayed end, or kind of a sharper end that's useful to work with smaller spaces. So now you quickly mix in one direction. So you notice the epoxy turns opaque, and then when it starts turning clear again, that means it's ready to set. It's starting to set. So while it's opaque, it's still gooey. It's still fluid. So now you wrap some up on the end, just like spaghetti. You don't need too much, and you just start applying it. And remember, this stuff flows, so you don't want to put a whole bunch, because then you'll just make one big mess. So just put a little bit at a time, and don't worry, it'll seep in between the wires on its own. And you generally want to have a few sensors ready to go so that you don't waste the epoxy, because one pack of epoxy will last you probably probably like 5 or 6 sensors.
This is not a good example of that.
Yeah, this is.
But this is for demo purposes.
Yeah. In the name of demos. Now you should be careful not to put any epoxy on the circuit itself, because it'll change the capacitance. So try not to. And it's okay to use your finger if you're careful, but you have to wipe it on a napkin or something. That's about it. And then you just wait a couple minutes and it'll be dry. That's trivial, but what you actually want to do is get a ball of solder going. See, like that? You want a ball of solder on the end of your wire. Just kind of like that. See, I can do a little better. Like that. Okay, now I put in the vise some female header, just 2 pins, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to tin these. Just put a little bit of solder on each one. Put a ball of solder. You don't want to put too much. You don't want it to leak inside the connector, because then it'll fill up with solder and you won't be able to get the pin inside. Okay, now that we've tinned the connector and the wires, it's actually very easy to just touch the two together and they stick. Like so. Okay, now we have our band and we see that the wires are frayed, so we're gonna twist these and solder them so they'll be easier to put on. Okay, I've tinned the wires so they're ready to be soldered to the sensor board. So we mount the sensor board back on the vise in a way that's easy to access. Notice I'm holding the wires with the tweezers because these happen to be very fine wires, so they bend very easily. So that's why I'm not using pliers. So use tweezers. And if you recall, we pre-fill these vias with solder. So all we have to do is just touch it with the soldering iron to melt it, and then you just push the wire into the hole, just like threading a needle. Okay, now we have all the pieces together, and we sort of see how it's going to be fitting together inside the band. The sensor board bends over the radio board, and we have the battery that plugs in over here. You have your antenna. You want to keep the antenna away from the battery so it can radiate a little bit better. And we have the electrodes connected to the band. So now that we see how everything's going to fit, we're ready to wrap the circuit board in electrical tape. So we make a nice little tight package that we could then tuck into the band. Okay, we've wrapped each of the modules in electrical tape, and it's important to wrap them nice and tight so you stretch the tape as you go around. And then once they're individually wrapped, you fold one on top of the other, and now you can wrap another piece of tape around the entire module, like so. Okay, here we have the completed module, and I've gone ahead and plugged in the battery. This little connection here between the header and the battery should also have some epoxy on it to strain relief, but we'll do that later. And we're now ready to just stuff it into the band, and we're ready to go, like so. This band is a little too small for my wrist, but you get the idea.